Imagine waking up this September to find out a hypersonic missile just leveled a critical drone manufacturing factory, right? Like just outside of Berlin. Sirens are blaring, the European markets are in an absolute free fall, and everyone is basically just holding their breath, waiting for the United States to announce this massive, overwhelming military retaliation.
Right, the natural expectation.
Yeah, exactly. But the response from Washington is just absolute silence, nothing.
Yeah.
So today we are taking a deep dive into this terrifyingly plausible scenario where, a fundamentally misread war, a massive institutional blind spot, and just the sheer fragility of the global energy grid spark the total collapse of the Western alliance. And all of this before a single American boot even hits the ground.
And the really chilling part about the scenario is that it doesn't rely on like cartoonish supervillains or these sudden, totally irrational decisions. The source material we're digging into today maps out this escalation as well, as a cold mathematical certainty. Yeah. It's essentially framed as the inevitable result of decades of strategic miscalculations that are finally, colliding with physical reality.
And the person outlining this reality, it's important to note, is not some fringe internet blogger or armchair general. We are unpacking a really complex, highly provocative interview from Tucker Carlson's YouTube channel featuring an insider identified just as Mr. Jeremy.
Right, Mr. Jeremy.
Yeah, and we are talking about someone with a naval career dating all the way back to 1976. I mean, he served at the absolute highest levels of the British military establishment. He was the executive assistant to the chief of defense staff.
Which is a massive deal. But then, crucially, after his military career, he spent 15 years operating deep inside the global offshore energy sector.
Yeah, the energy sector.
Right. So he is looking at the world through these two incredibly specialized lenses simultaneously. I mean, you've got grand military strategy on one side and global energy logistics on the other.
And blending those two disciplines is what exceptionally rare, right?
Oh, absolutely. Usually you have like military planners who just sort of assume the global supply chain will magically adapt to whatever their tactical needs are.
Right. We need gas. It'll be there.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you have energy economists who assume geopolitical conflicts are just these temporary market fluctuations that will smooth out. But this insider argues that you cannot separate the two. A failure in military strategy directly triggers an energy crisis. And a localized energy crisis can instantly neutralize a superpower's military capabilities.
Wow. Okay, but before we go one step further, I need to lay down a very explicit disclaimer for you all about the nature of the material we are unpacking today. The interview we're analyzing is intensely politically charged, okay? And it's heavily critical of the current global consensus.
Heavily critical is almost an understatement.
Yeah, fair. Mr. Jeremy offers these severe, unsparing indictments of Western leadership. He openly questions NATO's institutional competence, and he pretty much dismantles the strategies currently being employed in Ukraine. Furthermore, his arguments heavily favor Russia's strategic military posture, suggesting that Moscow is executing this highly rational long-term strategy while the West is essentially, flailing in the dark.
And it is absolutely crucial to state here that our role on this deep dive is not to take a side. We are not endorsing his viewpoints, we're not validating his political critiques, and we are certainly not pushing any political agenda whatsoever.
Exactly. Our sole purpose is to impartially break down the claims made in this specific source text. We are doing this so that you, the listener, can understand the exact arguments, the historical data he references, and the underlying logic he uses to build his entire case.
Right. We just want to unpack the framework he's presenting.
Which brings us to the roadmap for today. We're going to move from his controversial 5-phase breakdown of Russia's military strategy over to his analysis of NATO's alleged incompetence, right into that terrifying hypothetical escalation scenario in Europe. And finally, we'll look at how a global energy market might be the ultimate domino to fall. Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how we could possibly reach that nightmare scenario in September, we actually have to go back to the philosophical root of the conflict.
Yeah, we have to look at the battlefield through a completely different lens than, say, the one provided by the evening news. The insider leans heavily on Karl von Clausewitz, the legendary Prussian military theorist.
Oh, right, Clausewitz.
Yeah, and the foundational rule of Clausewitz is that the single most important decision a leader makes is understanding the true nature of the war they are fighting.
The nature of the war, meaning what exactly?
Meaning, if you misdiagnose the nature of the war, every single subsequent tactical decision you make is going to be flawed. The insider argues the West has suffered a catastrophic failure of diagnosis here. From the perspective of Washington, London, and Brussels, this conflict has almost always been framed as a war of choice by Russia.
Right, like a land grab driven by imperial ambition.
Exactly. But the source points out that for Moscow, this is viewed unequivocally as an existential war. It is about the fundamental preservation and survival of the Russian state against perceived encirclement.
And that word existential, I mean, that changes the entire mathematical equation of the conflict, doesn't
It
it?
changes everything.
Because if you are fighting a war of choice, your tolerance for economic pain and military casualties is, well, it's relatively low. You cut your losses when it gets too expensive. But if you genuinely believe you're fighting for your actual life, your pain tolerance is virtually infinite. You'll mobilize your entire society, burn through your sovereign wealth, and endure almost any sanction just to survive.
And the insider really emphasizes that this existential framing by Russia wasn't some sudden paranoid delusion. It was a reaction to decades of ignored warnings. He brings up George Kennan.
Okay, Kennan, the architect of the Cold War containment strategy.
That's the one. Kennan warned way back in 1996 that expanding NATO eastward would be the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era. The insider also cites John Mearsheimer's 2014 analysis, which basically predicted that pushing Western military infrastructure into Ukraine would ultimately compel Russia to just wreck the country rather than let it become a Western bulwark.
Wow, so he's saying these weren't just academic theories.
Right. He argues these were clear, articulated red lines that the West simply chose to ignore, completely violating that core Clausewitzian principle of understanding your adversary.
And he points out that current Western rhetoric only reinforces that existential fear in Moscow, right? I mean, he explicitly names Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister. She has spoken publicly about the need to, quote, break up the Russian Federation into smaller entities.
Which is wild if you think about how that lands in Moscow.
Exactly. If you are sitting in the Kremlin and you hear the leaders of neighboring NATO countries openly discussing the literal dismemberment of your nation, you aren't going to treat the conflict as a border dispute. You are going to treat it as a fight for absolute survival.
Which leads directly into his really controversial breakdown of how Russia has actually prosecuted this war. Because, if you view the conflict through the lens of a quick imperial land grab, Russia looks wildly incompetent.
Yeah.
I mean, the lines on the map haven't moved significantly in months.
Right. We constantly hear Russia is failing because they aren't taking huge chunks of territory. But wait, how does he explain that?
Well, the insider proposes this 5-phase strategic framework that suggests Russia isn't failing to capture territory. Rather, capturing territory is secondary to a much larger systemic objective.
This framework completely flips the narrative for anyone paying attention to the mainstream coverage.
Yes.
Let's break down these 5 phases. He says phase 1, which started in early 2022, was actually about diplomatic force. And he points to the numbers to prove it. Russia initially went into Ukraine with roughly 190,000 troops. Now, to a layperson, you or me, that sounds like a massive army. But Ukraine is the largest country located entirely in Europe.
Right, it's massive.
Historically, military doctrine requires a huge ratio of troops to civilian population to successfully occupy and hold a hostile nation. We're talking millions of troops required to garrison a country that size, not 190,000.
Exactly. And the Russian general staff, they are heavily focused on mathematics and logistics. They knew 190,000 troops could never occupy Ukraine. So the insider argues this initial push was never meant to be an occupation force. It was an armed demonstration designed to force a political settlement.
Basically a high-stakes pressure tactic.
Right. And according to his analysis, it nearly achieved that exact goal. By March and April of 2022, during the talks in Istanbul, a diplomatic resolution was reportedly right on the table. The terms were largely focused on Ukrainian neutrality, some guarantees against NATO membership, and self-determination for the eastern Donbas region.
So the conflict could have literally ended just weeks after it began, with Ukraine largely intact territorially.
That's his claim. But the insider says that diplomatic off-ramp was explicitly dismantled by the West. He specifically points the finger at Boris Johnson, operating with the backing of the Biden administration, for flying to Kyiv and allegedly convincing President Zelensky to walk away from the negotiating table. The promise was that the collective West would back Ukraine indefinitely in a total war against Russia.
Wow. Okay, so when that diplomatic avenue completely collapsed, Russia immediately recognized that the nature of the war had shifted. They were no longer conducting this limited operation to force a treaty. They were now engaged in a full-blown proxy war with the combined industrial and military weight of NATO.
And that realization triggered Phase 2, which the insider labels militarist withdrawal and contact.
This is where we saw those initial Russian pullbacks from areas around Kyiv and Kharkiv, right? Because in the West, that was universally celebrated as a massive, humiliating defeat for the Russian army.
Oh yeah, it was everywhere in the news. But the insider describes it entirely differently. He calls it a calculated, necessary retreat. The Russian lines were overextended, they were exposed and logistically fragile against a newly Western-backed Ukrainian force. So what do? They traded space for time.
Right. They fell back to defensible terrain and began constructing what became known as the Surovikin Line, named after the Russian general who designed it. And from what the source says, this wasn't just, like, a trench.
No. It was a staggering feat of combat engineering. We are talking about hundreds of miles of layered defenses, massive complex minefields, those concrete anti-tank obstacles everyone calls Dragon's Teeth, pre-sighted artillery zones, and deep networks of reinforced bunkers.
Which perfectly sets up Phase 3, beginning in late 2022. The insider calls this attritional defense, and this is the core of it, right? If you turn on the evening news, you hear Russia is failing because the lines on the map haven't moved. But if you view this through the lens of attritional warfare, static lines aren't a failure, they are the entire point.
It's the whole strategy.
It sounds like we're watching a football game and screaming at a team for not throwing risky Hail Mary passes into the end zone, completely missing the fact that they have a comfortable lead and they're literally just running the ball to drain the clock and guarantee the win.
That's a great analogy. Because the objective in Phase 3 was never to take more land. It was to use the Surovikin Line as an anvil against which the Ukrainian military would basically shatter itself.
An anvil?
Yeah. The insider points out that the famous Russian stated goals of demilitarization and denazification were largely misinterpreted in the West as just pure political propaganda. But in reality, according to him, they were literal operational directives. Demilitarization meant the physical, systemic destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces, grinding down their manpower and just exhausting their stockpiles of Western-supplied armor and ammunition.
And the tragic part of this whole analysis is that the source believes the West actually played right into this Russian strategy by constantly demanding offensive action, to justify the billions in military aid Western leaders basically pressured Ukraine to launch these massive counteroffensives.
Right, into the teeth of the defense.
Exactly. The insider notes that Ukraine threw the equivalent of 2 entire field armies against the Surovikin Line throughout 2023. And the result was just devastating casualties and the loss of irreplaceable armor, all without achieving any significant strategic breakthrough. Russia just sat behind their layered defenses, utilizing their massive artillery advantage, and let the Ukrainian forces exhaust themselves.
And once that exhaustion reached a critical tipping point, Russia transitioned into Phase 4, which the source identifies as offensive attrition. This started in late 2023 and is continuing today. Having spent the previous year fully mobilizing their domestic industrial base to churn out artillery shells, drones, and glide bombs at a pace the West just couldn't match, Russia began to slowly, methodically step out of their trenches.
But again, it's not a blitzkrieg. They aren't trying to capture 100 miles in a week. If Phase 3 was about letting the enemy break themselves against a wall, Phase 4 feels like the natural, brutal evolution of that. Once the enemy is depleted, you start grinding forward, but you prioritize the destruction of enemy units over the rapid seizure of ground.
Exactly. And the defining characteristic of Phase 4, according to the insider, is the absolute lack of Ukrainian air superiority. I mean, in modern conventional warfare, attempting to hold ground or launch offensives without controlling the skies is virtually impossible.
It's just a death sentence.
It really is. Russia is leveraging its massive advantage in tactical aviation, dropping thousands of these heavy glide bombs that completely obliterate defensive fortifications long before Russian infantry even moves forward. They are systematically pushing the Ukrainian lines back while minimizing their own exposure.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of the conflict, Phase 5. If this grinding attritional advance just continues, what is the actual endgame on the map? Like, what does Russia consider a victory?
Well, the source outlines 2 potential endpoints, both centered on the concept of a buffer zone to guarantee Russian security. So the minimalist objective would be securing the entirety of the Donbass, maintaining Crimea, and solidifying control over the 4 eastern oblasts they have currently annexed.
Okay, so that creates a solid land bridge and a significant territorial buffer.
Right. But the maximalist objective is much, much more expansive.
Yeah.
The insider points out that Vladimir Putin has repeatedly used the historical term Novorossiya, or New Russia.
And achieving Novorossiya would mean pushing significantly further west, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It would involve taking control of Odessa, which is a critical port city, and incorporating several more western oblasts. This would effectively landlock whatever remains of the Ukrainian state, completely crippling its economic viability and creating this massive, impenetrable buffer zone stretching across the entire southern coast. The insider genuinely believes the Russian general staff has the resources and the patience to pursue either objective, really depending on how long the West is willing to sustain the attritional grind.
Wow. Okay, so if Russia is operating on this deliberate multi-decade timeline, meticulously transitioning from diplomatic pressure to attritional defense to offensive grinding, I mean, that forces a really uncomfortable question about our own leadership.
It does.
Because if his analysis is correct, the West hasn't just misread the battlefield, we've been comprehensively outplayed.
And the insider is totally unforgiving on this point. He argues that the collective West is suffering from a profound institutional lag. He introduces this concept from the French military strategist General André Beaufort, who posited a very harsh rule of war, which is the loser ultimately deserves to lose.
Deserves to lose. Because failure in conflict isn't just bad luck. It's the direct, undeniable consequence of inadequate strategic thinking and a failure to prepare.
Exactly. And the source applies Beaufort's law directly to modern NATO. He highlights the glaring cognitive dissonance of an alliance that, let's remember, spent 20 years fighting a counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan.
A war that ended in a chaotic, humiliating withdrawal against an adversary armed with small arms and pickup trucks.
Right. And now that same alliance genuinely believes it possesses the institutional competence, the industrial base, and the strategic brilliance to defeat the most heavily armed, battle-hardened, conventional land army on the planet.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. He brings up a piece of analysis from the Quincy Institute that I found absolutely staggering. It's a paradox that pretty much defines the entire crisis. The quote asserts that NATO is an organization that exists to confront a threat created by its own existence, yet it lacks the actual power to confront the threat its existence has created.
It's just a devastating critique of alliance expansion. By continually pushing eastward, NATO generated the exact existential paranoia in Russia that guaranteed a conflict. Yet, because European nations hollowed out their own defense budgets for decades, essentially relying entirely on the American security umbrella, NATO lacks the conventional military cohesion and the massive industrial ammunition capacity required to actually defeat Russia in a prolonged land war.
They built the trap, walked right into it, and realized they forgot to bring a weapon.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But how does an alliance of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nations on Earth arrive at such a catastrophic failure of strategy? The insider blames what he calls a total competence crisis among Western leadership. He actually refuses to even use the word elites anymore, because to him, elite implies a standard of high performance and rigorous intellectual capability that is just completely absent in modern capitals.
And he provides specific, highly critical assessments of key figures to illustrate this point. Returning to Kaja Kallas, the interviewer recounts a story of observing her at a diplomatic dinner. The consensus among the foreign policy professionals in the room was one of sheer bewilderment. She was described as completely uninformable, completely resistant to nuance.
Wait, uninformable?
Yeah, she allegedly viewed this incredibly dangerous nuclear-shadowed geopolitical standoff through the simplistic comic book lens of Hitler versus Churchill.
Wow. I mean, when your leaders reduce complex statecraft to a Hollywood morality play, strategy becomes impossible. And he doesn't spare the leadership in Brussels either. He points to Ursula von der Leyen, the current president of the European Commission. The insider notes that during his time in service, her tenure as Germany's defense minister was widely considered a disaster.
Right. She presided over a period where the German military was notoriously underfunded, under-equipped, and plagued by readiness issues. Yet, despite that track record of institutional failure in the defense sector, she was elevated to lead the entire European Union during its most severe security crisis since World War II.
He also extends this critique to figures like Mark Rutte, the incoming NATO Secretary General, basically suggesting there's this continuous degradation of leadership quality. The core argument here is that the incentive structures of modern Western politics have fundamentally shifted. Politicians are no longer rewarded for executing sound, long-term, grand strategy.
Not at all. They're rewarded for mastering spin.
Spin.
Exactly. The primary objective is to manage the daily media narrative, craft sound bites, and ensure survival through the next short-term election cycle.
And when spin replaces strategy, you become a prisoner of your own narrative. The insider points out that the Western media biosphere is dominated by a profound Russophobia and an overwhelming preference for the underdog story. The public is fed a continuous, simplified diet, right? Like, Russia is universally incompetent and on the verge of collapse, while Ukraine is the heroic underdog constantly on the cusp of total victory, provided we just send them one more weapon system.
While he doesn't claim the public is being told outright fabrications every single day, he insists they're being subjected to a massive deception by omission. I mean, by consuming news that flatters our ideological preferences and reinforces the underdog narrative, the public is never forced to understand the actual mathematical realities of the battlefield. We never see the vast disparity in industrial production or the true motivations of the adversary. And when leaders prioritize media spin over strategic reality, and the public is shielded from the mathematical truth of a conflict, those leaders eventually miscalculate. They start believing their own simplified rhetoric. And that inevitable miscalculation is the exact trigger for the terrifying escalation scenario the insider maps out.
Right, the nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
He specifically targets this comforting narrative currently circulating in European defense circles. The idea that Europe recognizes its vulnerabilities and is rearming, with the goal of being fully prepared for a potential conventional war with Russia by the year 2030.
It's a timeline that just completely assumes the enemy is going to politely wait around.
Right. Why on earth would the Russian general staff, who are currently sitting on a massive mobilized war economy and a battle-tested army, just sit back and do absolutely nothing for 6 years while Germany, France, and Britain rebuild their militaries?
They wouldn't. The enemy always gets a vote. And the insider presents a hypothetical yet highly structured timeline where the spark ignites much sooner, potentially as early as this September. The catalyst in his scenario is a decision by the E3, Germany, Britain, and France.
Okay, in this scenario, driven by the need to show political resolve as the Ukrainian front lines deteriorate, the E3 authorized the use of their most advanced weapon systems for deep strikes directly into the Russian homeland. We are talking about long-range cruise missiles carrying 250-kilogram high-explosive warheads detonating in Russian cities.
The assumption in Western capitals might be that Russia will simply absorb the strikes, issue a fiery denunciation at the United Nations, and just continue the localized war in Ukraine out of fear of sparking World War III. But the insider argues this fundamentally misunderstands Russian doctrine. Russia has drawn red lines before, and they have acted on them with overwhelming force.
So if those E-3 missiles hit Russian territory, how does Moscow retaliate in this scenario? Do they roll tanks into Poland?
No, they don't respond with a ground invasion of Europe. They respond with surgical, asymmetric, and utterly devastating strikes. The insider proposes that Russia would utilize its arsenal of hypersonic missiles weapons like the Kinzhal or the Zircon to systematically annihilate the defense industrial base of the E3.
So they would go after the factories.
Exactly. They would specifically target the factories manufacturing the very drones and missiles used in the attack, striking deep inside Britain, France, and Germany.
The moment a Russian missile detonates in London or Berlin, the immediate assumption of almost every citizen in the West is that it's game over. Article 5 is invoked, the full unified might of NATO is unleashed, and World War III basically begins.
But the insider completely dismantles what he calls the myth of Article 5.
Wait, how is Article 5 a myth?
Well, yes. If a member state is attacked, Article 5 of the NATO treaty is invoked, declaring that an attack on one is an attack on all. However, he points to a massive, legally binding caveat that is almost universally ignored in public discourse. The text of Article 5 does not legally obligate every single member state to automatically declare war and deploy their own armed forces.
Yeah.
It obligates them to assist the attacked party in a manner they deem necessary.
Wait, so they don't actually have to fight? That is a staggering loophole. It's not an automatic trigger for a unified global army.
Exactly the opposite. In his scenario, the unified front of NATO instantly fractures. Countries like Hungary or Spain or Italy, they look at the smoking ruins of a factory in Germany and say, "We explicitly warned you not to authorize deep strikes into Russia. You provoked this retaliation. We are not sacrificing our cities and our citizens to fix your strategic blunder." They might send medical supplies or, issue statements of solidarity, but they are absolutely not sending troops or firing their own weapons.
But the fracture in Europe isn't even the most important part of this scenario. The only question that dictates the survival of the alliance is the reaction of the United States.
And this is where the insider's analysis gets truly chilling.
Mm-hmm.
He believes the United States would hesitate and ultimately back away.
Really?
Yeah. Put yourself in the position of the American president in this scenario.
Yeah.
The European powers launched deep strikes into Russia against the advice of American intelligence. Russia retaliated proportionately against European military targets, exactly as their doctrine dictates. Is the American president going to authorize the deployment of hundreds of thousands of U.S. ground troops to fight and die in a European meat grinder against a battle-hardened Russian military, risking a global nuclear holocaust, just to defend European capitals that acted recklessly?
Especially in the middle of a highly contentious domestic election cycle where the American public is just completely exhausted by foreign interventions. The political math simply doesn't support it. So Europe is suddenly left isolated, facing a conventional war against a pure adversary. But surely Europe has the technology to defend itself. I mean, we constantly hear about the supremacy of Western air defense. Can't they just activate the Patriot missile batteries and shoot the Russian hypersonics down?
The insider leans heavily on his background as a former anti-air warfare commander on a guided missile destroyer to explain the terrifying physical reality of modern air defense. He bluntly states that Europe's defensive posture is shockingly porous. He quotes analysis from Ted Postel,
Who is that?
a highly respected MIT professor and expert on missile defense technology. Postel's assessment suggests that the highly touted Patriot PAC-3 interceptor systems might only achieve an effectiveness rate of around 3% against modern, sophisticated saturation attacks.
3%. That's not a defense, that's a rounding error. But we need to explain why that number is so low. It's not that the Patriot system is poorly built, right?
No, it's about the physics of the engagement. The PAC-3 and similar systems were primarily designed to intercept conventional ballistic missiles. A traditional ballistic missile follows a predictable parabolic arc. Once the radar tracks the launch, computers calculate the trajectory, find the interception point, and launch the defense missile to meet it in space. But modern warfare has evolved.
Right, because Russia isn't just firing a single, predictable missile. They use saturation tactics. They launch a wave of cheap decoy drones to blind and overwhelm the radar systems, forcing the defenders to exhaust their multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles on literal garbage. And once the radar horizon is cluttered and the magazines are empty, the real threat arrives.
And that real threat is the hypersonic glide vehicle. These weapons travel at Mach 5. Or significantly faster, sometimes cloaked in a plasma stealth sheath generated by atmospheric friction that actually absorbs radar waves. But their most dangerous characteristic isn't just speed, it's maneuverability.
They can change direction.
Exactly. Unlike a ballistic missile, a hypersonic vehicle can alter its trajectory in the mid-course and terminal phases of flight. If the missile is constantly changing direction at a mile a second, the Patriot's computer cannot calculate an interception point. By the time the system registers the final flight path, the missile has already detonated. The insider states categorically that against these specific weapons, Europe has absolutely zero viable defense.
Right. So conventional deterrence fails, air defense fails. Which brings us to the absolute nightmare scenario, the ultimate pushback, the nuclear option. If France and Britain are watching their defense industrial base get dismantled by unstoppable conventional missiles, why wouldn't they just open the silos and use their nuclear arsenals to force Russia to back down?
The interviewer asks this exact question, and the insider calls it the $64,000 question. Yes, Britain and France possess independent nuclear deterrence. But again, you have to look at the cold, hard mathematics of mutually assured destruction. Combined, Britain and France possess perhaps a few hundred nuclear warheads, mostly submarine-launched. Russia possesses an estimated 5,500 nuclear weapons distributed across a massive survivable triad of silos, mobile launchers, and submarines.
It's like two people standing in a small, sealed room, waist-deep in gasoline. Britain is holding a single match, and Russia is holding a military-grade flamethrower. It doesn't matter who has the bigger weapon or who strikes first. The sheer physical reality is that the moment a spark is introduced, they both burn equally and completely.
That is a perfect analogy. If a leader in London or Paris authorizes a limited nuclear strike to halt a conventional defeat, they are signing the death warrant of their entire civilization. The Russian response would be immediate and overwhelming. The insider simply cannot fathom any sane political leader actually making that decision. Therefore, in a localized conventional European conflict, the nuclear deterrent is effectively neutralized by the sheer asymmetry of the arsenals.
So the E3 is completely paralyzed. They're politically fractured from NATO, abandoned by U.S. ground forces, physically incapable of stopping hypersonic strikes, and mathematically deterred from using their nuclear weapons. But physical destruction of military sites is just the opening move in this scenario. The real vulnerability, the one that doesn't require a single nuclear warhead to bring the West to its knees, is the power grid.
And this is where the insider's deep expertise in the global offshore energy sector really takes center stage. He argues that Russia's most devastating weapon isn't the Kinzhal missile. It's their capacity to inflict global economic contagion by targeting energy infrastructure. He suggests Russia would surgically strike European liquid natural gas terminals in places like Rotterdam or critical oil refineries in Milford Haven.
Because energy isn't just another commodity. It is the fundamental physics of the global economy.
He introduces a stark, undeniable mathematical reality. Over the long term, the correlation between global energy consumption and global GDP is approximately 0.99.
So they are essentially the exact same thing.
Yes, economic growth is, quite literally, the process of transforming energy into goods and services.
Yeah.
If you remove 10% of the physical energy from the global system, global GDP does not adapt through efficiency. It drops by a corresponding 10%.
Wow.
And a 10% contraction in global GDP is not just a recession, it is a catastrophic systemic depression.
And the tragic irony, the insider points out, is that Europe has already spent the last 4 years eagerly setting the stage for its own economic ruin. In response to the initial invasion, Europe levied massive sanctions against Russia, essentially choosing to disconnect themselves from their primary energy supplier. They voluntarily cut off access to Russian pipeline natural gas, which constituted 40% their supply, and crucially, they cut off Russian diesel, which also represented 40% of their consumption.
The focus on diesel is vital here. We often think of energy solely in terms of electricity or, the gasoline in our cars. But the insider challenges anyone to map out how a modern, complex industrial society functions for even a week without diesel fuel.
Right, let's walk through the physical mechanics of that. Diesel doesn't just run the 18-wheelers that stock the grocery stores, though that alone would cause mass starvation in cities. Diesel powers the massive agricultural combines that harvest the wheat. It powers the commercial fishing fleets. It powers the heavy earth-moving equipment required to mine the raw materials like copper and lithium needed for renewable energy grids.
Right, you need diesel to build solar panels.
Exactly. Furthermore, natural gas and petroleum byproducts are the foundational feedstock for the Haber-Bosch process, which creates the synthetic fertilizers that literally keep half the global population alive. It is like a hospital proudly turning off its massive backup diesel generators to save money right at the exact moment the city's main power grid is collapsing. You are stripping away the very lifeblood of the physical economy.
And this self-inflicted vulnerability in Europe is incredibly dangerous because it is colliding with a massive secondary crisis happening simultaneously in the Middle East. The insider highlights the severely underreported ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Red Sea shipping lanes.
This is the bottleneck caused by the tensions involving Iran and the various proxy conflicts disrupting maritime traffic, right?
Yeah, and he points out a staggering figure. Roughly 12 to 13 million barrels of oil per day are effectively being taken out of normal, efficient circulation or severely delayed due to the closure or restriction of these vital maritime choke points. Ships are being forced to reroute thousands of miles around the continent of Africa, absorbing massive costs and time delays.
But wait, if you tell the average person that 13 million barrels of oil are missing from the daily market, their first question is going to be, why isn't gasoline $10 a gallon right now? Why aren't the alarms sounding in every financial capital?
Right, and the insider explains this discrepancy through the concept of the lag gauge. The global energy market is unimaginably vast, and the physical delivery systems move incredibly slowly. We are accustomed to information moving at the speed of light, but physical commodities are bound by the laws of physics.
The logistics of a barrel of oil are actually fascinating. A massive supertanker hauling crude from the Persian Gulf doesn't move like a jet. It travels at about 12 knots. That is roughly the speed of a person riding a bicycle. Even oil moving overland through pipelines across the United States, say from the massive storage hub in Cushing, Oklahoma, travels at a walking pace of maybe 3 to 8 miles per hour.
Because of this physical lag, it takes months for a major disruption at the point of origin to physically manifest as a shortage at a refinery in Europe or North America. The markets aren't reacting yet because the pipeline hasn't completely run dry at the destination point.
And in the meantime, to prevent prices from spiking and causing political unrest, Western governments have been burning through their emergency savings accounts.
It's exactly the strategy. To buffer the blow of the missing Middle Eastern oil and the sanctioned Russian oil, nations have been aggressively drawing down their strategic petroleum reserves. The insider notes that the primary U.S. storage facility in Cushing has been depleted to dangerously low levels, hovering around 20% of its total capacity. We are masking a structural supply deficit by draining our emergency reserves, but, those reserves are finite.
While the West is draining its reserves to maintain the illusion of stability, how is China, the world's manufacturing engine, reacting to this tightening market?
China's reaction demonstrates a profound understanding of geopolitical vulnerability. The insider points out that Beijing saw the disruption coming and deliberately orchestrated a reduction in their domestic oil demand by about 5 million barrels a day, pivoting heavily to electric transit and domestic coal to insulate themselves.
But more importantly, while we are draining our reserves, China has been quietly hoarding. The insider notes they are currently sitting on the world's largest strategic reserve, estimated at an incredible 1.3 billion barrels of oil.
Right. And they hold that massive reserve not just to power their own cities, but because they deeply understand the interconnected fragility of the global supply chain. The insider points to the vulnerability of Taiwan. Taiwan is the beating heart of the global technology sector, producing upwards of 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors.
Yeah, everything relies on them.
Exactly. If a blockade or an energy shock cuts off fuel to Taiwan, those massive semiconductor foundries go dark. If the foundries go dark, the global manufacturing of everything from smartphones to automobiles to medical equipment just crashes. And if the global tech economy crashes, nobody is buying Chinese exports. China holds that 1.3 billion barrel reserve as an insurance policy to ensure their entire regional supply chain, including their economic rivals, doesn't collapse.
Okay, but we really need to address the glaring contradiction in the financial data here. The interviewer asks the insider, if the reserves are draining, if the Strait of Hormuz is choked, and if Europe is starved of diesel, why is the price on the screen, the Brent crude futures contract, only showing around $71 a barrel in the transcript? That price reflects a calm, well-supplied market.
This is one of the most vital technical clarifications in the entire interview. The insider exposes the dangerous disconnect between the financial paper markets and the physical commodity markets. To understand this, we have to look at what the industry calls the crack spread.
Let's define that clearly. The crack spread isn't the difference between paper and physical oil. It is the profit margin a refinery makes by purchasing a barrel of raw, unrefined crude oil and cracking it, or refining it, into usable products like gasoline, jet fuel, and crucially, diesel.
Precisely. The $71 price tag is for the raw crude oil futures contract traded by financiers in London or New York. It is a paper derivative. Right. But you cannot run a tractor or a backup generator on raw crude oil. The insider spoke to a colleague operating in the physical shipping markets in Singapore who revealed a terrifying reality. While the paper price for crude was $71, buyers who needed actual physical delivery of refined diesel to keep their commercial operations running were paying massive premiums, effectively pushing the real-world cost of the energy they needed closer to an equivalent of $200 a barrel.
The refining capacity is bottlenecked, the physical shipping lanes are choked, and the sanctions have broken the efficient supply chains. The paper price is a financial fiction maintained by traders. The physical crack spread is screaming panic as actual consumers bid up the price of the refined fuels they desperately need to survive.
And when that physical reality finally breaks the illusion of the financial markets, the correction is going to be violent. The insider compares the current energy market lag to the famous incident when the Ever Given container ship blocked the Suez Canal. The logistics industry learned a harsh metric from that crisis. For every one single day a critical choke point is blocked, it takes the global logistics system 6 days to untangle the backlog and recover.
Wait, a 1-to-6 ratio?
Yes. So even if the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine magically stop tomorrow and the Strait of Hormuz completely opened, the global energy system is running on absolute fumes. The backlog is immense. The insider predicts that when this physical shortage finally hits the broader financial markets and the emergency reserves run dry, we are looking at a massive systemic global economic crash, potentially rivaling or exceeding the 2008 financial crisis hitting as early as this autumn or the first quarter of the new year.
It is just a staggering interlocking sequence of failures. You have a fundamentally misread war in Ukraine, which leads to institutional panic within a hollowed-out NATO, which triggers a desperate political decision to launch deep strikes, which causes a devastating Russian asymmetric retaliation, exposing Europe's complete lack of air defense. This then forces Russia to target the physical energy infrastructure, collapsing a global market that is already silently suffocating from the Red Sea shipping crisis and the depletion of strategic reserves.
It is the perfect storm. The hubris of military strategists colliding with the absolute unforgiving mathematics of the global energy grid.
So what does this all mean? If the physical economy is suffocating and the military options have devolved into a choice between humiliating defeat or nuclear suicide, how does this actually end? Does anyone step on the brakes, or are we just careening toward disaster? How does the insider see these two massive geopolitical crises resolving?
Well, he addresses the Middle East and Ukraine separately, though they are, as we've seen, completely linked by the underlying economics. For the Middle East, particularly the ongoing tensions involving Iran and the disruption of the shipping lanes, he believes a resolution won't be military. It will actually be forced by the American consumer.
That is fascinating. The U.S. military is the most powerful force in the region, but the military doesn't solve it.
The source argues that the Pentagon knows it cannot definitively win a conflict against Iran without deploying hundreds of thousands of ground troops for a massive occupation. And after 20 years in the Middle East, there's absolute zero political appetite among the American public for another endless ground war. So the military will conduct limited strikes, but the disruption will drag on. The endgame only arrives when the economic pain of the Hormuz closure, that physical $200 a barrel reality we discussed, finally bypasses the drained strategic reserves and hits the American consumer directly at the gas pump.
And timing is everything in politics, right? He points out this economic shockwave is scheduled to hit right as the United States enters a highly volatile midterm election cycle. When voters are suddenly faced with massive inflation, skyrocketing grocery prices due to diesel costs, and unaffordable gasoline, they don't care about grand strategy in the Middle East. They vote the incumbents out of office.
Exactly.
That severe domestic political threat, the fear of a total electoral wipeout, is the only thing powerful enough to force U.S. politicians to finally step back and aggressively de-escalate the tensions in the Gulf. The economy forces the peace.
Yeah, it's all about the domestic pressure.
So does he see a similar dynamic playing out in Europe regarding the conflict in Ukraine? Will economic exhaustion force a settlement there as well?
He sees economic exhaustion as the primary driver for Europe's exit. Yeah. As the energy crisis fully manifests, tipping Germany, Britain, and France into deep, painful recessions characterized by deindustrialization, the political calculus changes overnight. The insider predicts that the European citizenry, faced with bankruptcies and collapsing social services, will simply revolt against the idea of continuing to spend 5% of their shrinking GDP on a proxy war in Ukraine that they finally recognize is militarily unwinnable.
The political support for the war effort will just evaporate the moment the European middle class realizes they are being sacrificed to maintain it.
Right. But, the enemy gets a vote. Russia isn't just a passive observer waiting for European bond markets to collapse.
What if Russia decides not to wait for the slow economic strangulation of the West?
The insider offers an alternative, purely military endgame for Ukraine that Russia could initiate at any time. Rather than continuing the slow, attritional grind across the Eastern Front, the Russian General Staff could decide to decisively end the conflict by making a sudden, overwhelming political and military thrust directly at Kyiv.
Just end it quickly.
Yeah. The sole objective wouldn't be to occupy the city indefinitely, but to fundamentally collapse the Ukrainian government and force a capitulation. If the central command structure falls, the organized resistance ends, and the war is over on Russia's terms.
Which forces us to look really closely at the man who would make that call. How does Vladimir Putin fit into this endgame? Because the narrative we are fed continuously is that he is an isolated, unhinged dictator who might do something totally irrational at any moment.
The insider completely rejects that caricature of Putin as an erratic madman. He notes that he conducted a deep, objective analysis of Putin's profile, studying Philip Short's exhaustive biography and reviewing hours of the Oliver Stone interviews to really understand his psychology. His conclusion is that Putin is a highly calculated, deeply rational, and exceptionally strategic leader.
And his background informs his strategy, right? He isn't just a former KGB intelligence officer. The insider points out that Putin's postgraduate academic work was actually focused heavily on resource economics.
That detail is critical. It means Putin understands that 0.99 correlation between energy and global GDP far better than most Western politicians. He understands exactly how vulnerable the European industrial base is to a diesel shock. Furthermore, Putin does not operate in a vacuum. He is guided by a highly competent, deeply experienced general staff.
Right, the military apparatus around him.
Exactly. And the inside draws a sharp contrast here. While the U.S. spent 20 years failing to build a sustainable state in Afghanistan and exited in chaos, the Russian general staff's historical experience in Afghanistan was actually a planned 10-year campaign that concluded with a highly orderly, strategic withdrawal, leaving behind a client government that survived for years. They are methodical planners who understand the long game.
So if Putin is this deeply strategic, calculating leader, how does he react if the nightmare scenario actually triggers? If the E-3 fires those deep strike missiles into Russia this September, does Putin just mash the red button in a fit of rage?
No. The insider's prediction for how Russia manages that escalation is fascinatingly precise and chillingly calm. If the E-3 strikes, Putin's first move won't be a missile launch, it will be a phone call.
A phone call.
Yeah, he predicts Putin would immediately pick up the direct line to the White House. He would inform the American president with advance warning. The E-3 has crossed a red line. We are going to strike their defense manufacturing facilities.
Wow. That is a brilliant, ruthless diplomatic maneuver. By calling Washington first, Putin instantly isolates the United States from its European allies. He forces the American president to make a split-second decision. Do you want to involve the U.S. military and risk an intercontinental nuclear war to protect a drone factory in Berlin, or do you stand down and let Europe take the hit?
And the insider is completely confident the U.S. would stand down. Once that isolation is achieved, Putin would then issue a public, heavily telegraphed ultimatum to the leaders of Germany, France, and Britain. He would state clearly, stop supplying these weapons or we will systematically dismantle your production facilities.
It is a massive escalation, but it is entirely controlled.
Precisely. It is designed to force a political fracture within NATO, to humiliate the E-3 leadership, and to demonstrate overwhelming conventional dominance, all while deliberately staying below the threshold that would necessitate a nuclear exchange.
We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started by totally reframing the conflict through Russia's five-phase strategy, shifting the perspective from a stalled imperial invasion to a highly calculated, successful attritional defense. We explored the insider's brutal critique of NATO's institutional lag, exploring how decades of media spin and political short-termism have blinded Western leadership to strategic reality. We walked step by step through the terrifying mechanics of a European missile exchange, unpacking why hypersonic technology renders air defenses obsolete and why the nuclear deterrent is effectively neutralized. And finally, we dove deep into the mathematical certainty of the global energy market, exploring how a localized physical shortage of diesel, combined with the vulnerability of the maritime shipping lanes, could trigger a cascading collapse of the global economy.
It is a profoundly sobering, holistic view of geopolitics. It demands that we recognize how military action, industrial capacity, and global economics are inextricably linked. You literally cannot pull a thread in Eastern Europe without unraveling a supply chain in Asia and crashing a market in North America.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on the insider's warnings about the fragility of the energy grid, but looks at it from a slightly different angle. The source warns that the incredible complexity of the globalized economy, the fact that there is no single authority who can quickly untangle the Red Sea shipping crisis or instantly build a dozen new diesel refineries, is our greatest collective weakness.
Right. It is a system built entirely on just-in-time efficiency, with absolutely no tolerance for friction or geopolitical shock.
But here's the question we want you to explore on your own. What if this exact terrifying fragility is actually the only real safety net we have left?
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Think about the Cold War. For decades, the only thing that prevented the superpowers from engaging in World War III was the doctrine of a mad mutually assured destruction via nuclear weapons.
Right, the knowledge that if you launched the strike, your own cities would be reduced to ash within 30 minutes.
But today, as the insider pointed out, the sheer asymmetry of nuclear arsenals might make that specific deterrent less applicable in localized conflicts. So what replaces it? What if the guarantee of mutually assured economic destruction is the true 21st century deterrent?
It is a really compelling theory. If a missile strike in Europe destroys a critical natural gas hub, the resulting energy shortage doesn't just hurt Europe, it ripples outward, shutting down the semiconductor foundries in Taiwan, which immediately paralyzes the manufacturing sector in China, which then crashes the financial equity markets in the United States.
It's an invisible tripwire that connects everyone. Is the globalized economy a terrifying house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze to knock it down? Or is that very fragility, that absolute guarantee of shared economic devastation, the only force powerful enough to prevent these nations from escalating to total war? Is the mutual fear of $200 oil, mass unemployment, and domestic political revolution the only thing that will eventually force these leaders to stop firing missiles, abandon the political spin, and finally sit down at the negotiating table?
It really forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Is our shared economic vulnerability actually the last and perhaps most effective guardrail we have against global annihilation?
It is a massive question, a terrifying paradox, and exactly the kind of complex systemic issue we love unpacking with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, challenging journey today. We ask you to keep questioning the simplistic narratives you see on the evening news, look past the political spin to find the underlying mechanics, and we will see you on the next deep dive.